Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. I am David Gouthro, and today I have the pleasure of Kathy Jourdain as my guest. Welcome, Kathy. And you're on the opposite side of the country, I'm pretty
Yep,
sure.
I am. I'm in Nova Scotia, near Halifax.
Okay, well, that's about as far away as you can get from Vancouver. So, Kathy, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance and the value of a worldview. So, what
Yes,
a worldview is, how you get it, uh, what value it brings to all those kinds of things. So
sure.
maybe we just start off with what is a worldview?
Cool. So, worldviews are the lenses through which we see and experience the world. They're different for each of us. They um, they work largely in our unawareness because they influence our communication, our relationships, and any conflicts that we might be experiencing. And we often don't know or understand how they do that because we don't actually know what our worldview is. Huge question, right? What's your worldview? How do you know? We used to when we started we being my partner and I, my partner who's, based in the US, when we started working with worldviews, that's the question that we would ask people. We would say, "Worldviews are the lenses, they influence our actions give us information about our worldviews, and, they'll either confirm our worldview or the perspectives that we currently have, in which case we go, "Oh, that's cool, must be the right worldview," or they might challenge our worldview, in which case we don't usually go, "Oh, that's really interesting, let me think about that for a little bit."
So when I first heard the term worldview, I wasn't quite sure how to interpret it, what the context for that was. So is it the way that I look at the politics that are going on in the world? And it sounds like that's not what this is about. It's something it could be that, but something bigger,
Right.
broader, and deeper.
Yeah, so it's, how we look at politics or how we look at anything that's going on in the economy or how we experience whatever province we're living in or whatever city, that's all part of our worldview. So, our worldviews, we're not born with a worldview, but we're born into many worldviews because our parents have worldviews, our communities, our faith institutions, our schools. Other caregivers or family members we might come into contact with, they all have a worldview, and so as a baby and a young child, we just take on these perspectives without being aware that that's what we're doing. And so our worldviews shape our opinions. They shape our beliefs about the world, and they are they're not fixed, so they shift and change over time, but we say that worldviews are locally constructed and they're socially constructed. So they're constructed based on where we live, where we grew up, places that have had a significant influence on us, and they're based on, relationships. So every time we have a conversation with someone, it might influence our worldview perspective. Anytime we're in relationship with someone, again, that'll probably influence our worldview perspective.
So there's so many questions going through my mind. I'll let's see if I can grab one of them. And so it's I mean the visual image I have is that worldview is almost like a filter, largely unconscious or conscious, through which
Yes.
everything comes in. And
Yep.
and so I wonder how is that similar to a bias, a belief, a mindset, all those other kinds of things that are swirling around out there.
Those are really great questions because uh, we rely a lot on the neuroscience and the behavioral science to help us understand more about our worldviews. And our worldviews actually encompass all of those things, our biases, our beliefs. And the worldviews are very closely associated with our sense of identity. And the psychological research tells us that when our identity is challenged, we can respond as if our very life is threatened.
Okay.
And so sometimes you put a seemingly simple statement out there and you get this response that seems to be out of proportion. It's probably because our worldview's been challenged. And similarly, I think we've all had those experiences where we know that we're having a reaction that's out of proportion to the situation, but we don't necessarily know why. So if we look at all of the neurochemical responses to things, that gives us a sense of what's going on there.
So how do you how do you identify what your worldview is? And do you have the ability to shape it? So if it's a worldview
Oh,
that's not
mhm.
working for you, how do you influence? And maybe you could just tell me a little bit about the work that you do. I'm just thinking people may not know what the heck you do, Kathy. This wasn't like Kathy's going through a dictionary and let's pick a word,
Right?
worldview. Let's talk about that. So maybe you could give me a little bit about your background.
Thanks, David. So I'm a consultant, and I've been a consultant for about 25 years now. Prior to that, I was in the not for profit sector. I was the executive director of an Atlantic based health charity. And once I started to do consulting work, when I first started to do consulting work, I was pretty young at the time. But I also felt that as a facilitator and a consultant, you were supposed to carry in all the answers to everything. And it was incredibly stressful, especially when things were getting off track and you felt like you had to pull it all back on track. And a couple of years into consulting, I came across something called the art of hosting conversations that matter.
Hmm.
And I had walked into there was a community event happening. It was for Envision Halifax. And I walked into that room and I knew something was different the moment I walked into that room. So I was like, okay, I want to know what's going on here. And the difference is between facilitating something and hosting something. And so that curiosity took me to the art of hosting conversations that matter, which I did my first training in 2005. So more than 20 years ago now. And, the art of hosting is not a thing. It's not an organization. There are no staff. There's no head office. It's a self-organized network of practitioners all around the world. In 2005, when I did my first art of hosting training, there were 3 in the world. One was in England, one was in the US, and the other one was on Bowen Island out in British Columbia.
Yes, with Chris Corrigan.
Exactly,
Yep.
yes. Well, and actually, Chris wasn't even a host at that point.
Oh,
He was part of the network, but it was being hosted by other people, Toka Moeller, Tennyson Wolf, Teresa Pozzacani.
oh
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
so,
Those are
um
great folks.
right?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
and still good friends. So, once I learned about self-organization, never hosting alone, all of that. It informed my approach to facilitation, and now I knew that I didn't have to have the answers. I just needed to know the right questions to ask or the right process to provide because the intelligence exists within the room or within the group. So it made my job as a consultant a lot easier. And one of the components around hosting is about hosting yourself,
Mm.
which really is about being in your own journey of self-awareness and self-leadership so that you develop the ability to be present in any given situation. And I often tell people now, well, my partner Jerry and I, we say that the most powerful instrument you have in any situation that you're involved in is yourself.
Mm.
And so the more you know about yourself and what you react to, the better able you are to respond to anything that might come your way. And then when I teach art of hosting to people when I'm part of a training team, I will say to people, you know, when we're sitting in a room and something's going awry and we're thinking 5 steps ahead, trying to figure out how we're going to solve the problem. So we miss what's happening right now in this moment where if you ask a good question, you make a good observation, you hold that space, the answer is probably going to come from someone in the group. And then you can amplify that and then keep the group moving. So that's
So now,
what I do.
let's
Yeah,
and I'll make sure that we put some of that in the program notes because I think the
sure.
whole art of hosting and that is a fascinating way to engage people fully.
Right.
So now let's connect that to worldview.
Yeah. So, my partner, Jerry, who's both my business partner and my life partner, he also became part of the Art Hosting Network. And we met in 2010 through a variety of different circumstances and decided we should do some work together. So we did art of hosting training together here in Nova Scotia. And he brought the idea of worldviews into the training because he was doing his PhD dissertation on worldviews.
Oh. Hmm.
So he got his PhD from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And so he's the one who brought in this idea of we each have a worldview. It influences our actions in the world. The bridge between worldviews and actions is practices, what it is that we do in the world to bring our worldview alive. And and that came from, oh, it's originally from The Art of War, and Jim Gimian and Barry Boyce, who um, are Buddhists, and they published the Shambhala, some Shambhala newspaper a while ago. The Rules of Victory. Jim
Ah,
Gimian wrote The Rules of Victory based on The Art of War, and that's where Jerry got this idea of worldview practices and actions from them, and this notion of taking whole. And part of that whole body of work was you can't do harm to someone else without also doing harm to yourself.
okay.
And the whole premise of The Art of War is how not to go to war,
Right. Right.
which is interesting. So Jerry would bring this teaching into an art of hosting training, and we noticed that over 3 days, the idea of worldview, that word really took hold of people, and they started to use it, and they would say things like, "Well, from my worldview, I think
Huh.
this or that." And so that's where we would ask this big question. So, what's your worldview and how do you know? And people would really get this deer in the headlights look like, I have no idea what my worldview is. And truthfully, I couldn't answer that question either. And still, we marched on and we did like 2 or 3 years of worldview training using that question and a bunch of other things around it, of course. And one day we went, there's got to be an easier way into this conversation. That took us back to his dissertation, where he had come across a 6 point framework for looking at what your worldview is. The framework was created by um, Leo Apostle, who was a philosopher. Leo Apostle, he was a philosopher, and in the 1980s, he was concerned that the world was becoming increasingly fragmented and didn't know how to talk to people didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. And that was in the 1980s. And he wanted to create a mechanism so that people could begin to have those conversations. And he was, as a philosopher in the social sciences, he was particularly interested in social sciences versus other sciences and all of that. He put together a group, the Worldviews group. They did a lot of talking and thinking and speculating, and they came up with this 6 point framework. And Apostle's dream was that this framework would be used for practical application. And he died in the mid 90s before he had a chance to even see that in action. And it was like this framework sat on a shelf for 30 years until Jerry came across it in his research. So he picked it up. It had all of these great academic terms like epistemology and praxeology and other things that I didn't understand. Every time he used the words, I'm like, I have no idea what that means. And then he would explain it, and then I would still forget. So we translated it into English language that I can understand. And then I figure if I can understand it, everybody else can too. And so the 6 dimensions is reality, which is what is your day to day experiences. And, that's based on everything from, like, where do you live? Do you live with other people? Do you take care of people? Where do you shop? How do you go to work? If you go to work, what's your socioeconomic status?
Mm.
Skin color plays a role, gender plays a role, age plays a role, in our reality, and thus in our worldview. And the other part of reality is what we call, meta reality or meta belief systems. So what do we believe about good or evil? What do we believe about what's beautiful or what's ugly? What do we believe about deities or gods or whatever the case may be? So that's reality. The second one is history. Is what are all of the things that have influenced your worldview?
Okay.
And that's everything from where you grew up to your parents to school to marriage, divorce, travel, all of those things. And it doesn't just have to be your own personal experiences. It could be books that you read, movies that you watched,
Mhm.
or other community-wide experiences or global experiences like the pandemic has had an influence on our worldviews, in various directions
So
for
it sounds like anything up to this particular point in time.
pretty much. Yep.
Okay.
And then the third one is future, which is, how do we relate to the future? How do we think about the future? Do we even think about the future?
Mm.
So some people are planners and they're already planning 6, 12 months ahead. Other people are like, well, there's still like 3 months between then and that event and now. So I'm not even thinking about it. Or if your reality is that you're living in poverty, your sense of the future might be, am I going to have dinner tonight?
Right.
Versus if
Okay.
you've got a lot of wealth, then you could be thinking about, "Well, what am I doing next year or 10 years down the road?" Then we have, values, which on one level is pretty self-explanatory because we all have values, we all have some sense of what our values are. Value is the root of evaluate, so we base our choices, and our decisions on our values, and this
Mhm.
happens individually and collectively. And, also we have wiggle room in our values, which creates room for conflict. So when we're working with groups, we'll often say, "Do are you someone who might value honesty?" And people will usually go, "Yes." "Well, do you value kindness?" And people will go, "Yes." And I'll say, "Well, what do you think about this great new jacket I bought?" And they're like, uh, so are they gonna be kind? Are they gonna be honest? Or somewhere on that scale? And that's a simple example, but people are confronted with those kinds of choices all the time.
Okay. So we got reality, history, future, values.
Practices is the next one. And I think about practices in 2 ways. I think about them as habitual practices, which is we get up in the morning, we have a routine. That happens almost every morning unless something different's gonna happen in the day. And, then we have intentional practices. And for me, intentional practices are things that if you don't schedule them in your day, they might not happen. So I have a yoga practice and I have a meditation practice, but if I'm not thoughtful about when it's going to show up in my day, it might not. Now, for some people, these are the same thing. Like they can't get through a day without their exercise routine. I'm not one of those people, but so practices are really how do we live our life? How do we bring our worldview alive? How do we experience our reality? How do we live our values? And then the last one is knowledge. And knowledge is the sense of, well, how do we know what we know? And how do we know that what we know is true? And what sources of knowledge do we trust? Which gets to like your comment earlier about what's our views on politics. Well, it'll probably depend on what sources of knowledge we trust, because the more our worldviews are reinforced, then the more attached we become to them. And so then when we think about sources of knowledge, sources of information, we know now that people show up in the same space, living in the same physical world, but seemingly living in very different realities. And
So,
oh, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
Well, so the last, maybe probably not the last thing, but the next thing I'll say about the 6 dimensions is this is a framework that I can use to look at my own worldview and understand my own worldview, but then I can also try to understand your worldview. And brilliantly, it works to look at a team, an organization, a community, some other group that we might be interested in. We can use those same 6 dimensions to get an understanding of what another worldview might be. And in our consulting work, we've used this to help people understand how they've gotten to where they are and to identify where they want to go. So,
Mm.
maybe we're looking at history and reality to understand where we are, but then we want to look at what's the future that we want and what are the practices that are going to take us there, or what is the knowledge that we need to develop in order to live into this future that we're looking for. So it's simple, it's coherent, it's easy to understand. Most people remember the 6 dimensions after only hearing them once, and it's powerful in its use.
So, I'm just thinking about this, and it seems like all of those six together, are probably like, how do you know when you need to change your worldview? And it's kind of like if you're if you're not happy, if something's not working
Mm,
for you, it might be an opportunity to say, "Let me look at my worldview.
right.
What's working about this?" And presumably, there's some things I can't change. Like I can't change my history, but maybe I can reinterpret it. Like some
Absolutely.
right, some things like
Yeah.
that, how do I get my worldview to help me either be more the way I want to be or get to where I want to get or things like that. When you were talking about teams, it seems the other thing about understanding worldview that if I look at someone who's different from me and
Mhm.
try to understand what their worldview is, I may not like the way we are with each other, but at least I can
Right.
understand it and appreciate it and have a willingness to say that maybe, there's something that this person can't change or has gone through. So me judging it isn't going to help us get anywhere.
Right. Right. And when sometimes we do this exercise around, thinking about a time when you were activated, or I hate the word triggered, so I hate to use that word, but, and, or you got really upset about something. Like drawing on the, um, brain science, we talk about amygdala hijack and what happened there, and you can use the 6 dimensions to begin to understand which what was it that actually activated me or that tripped me up, into anger? And so, like, I know for myself, values is a core one
Yeah.
where anything that feels like it's attacking someone or lies or taking advantage of situations, like those are all things that can get me riled up and going if I let them. And so just knowing that can be useful. And like you just said, understanding where someone else's worldview might have come from, because we don't know until we have the conversation,
Yeah. Mhm.
um, allows me to bring maybe a little bit more compassion and understanding and empathy to that. And even as I say that, I recognize that there are such extreme polarizations that exist right now that can be a huge challenge. And even for me, like, okay, I understand how they might have gotten that worldview. I still don't agree with it. And this is not about agreeing with people's worldviews. And it still makes me angry.
Yeah, and just thinking to have as an automatic response when you feel some sense of conflict, it
Hmm.
just is to start with an eyes up, like, "Oh, that person probably has a different worldview,"
Right.
right? Without
Right.
about to justify it, but kind of say it's all bought and paid for. So,
Right.
it's like, you used to say it's kind of a trivial comment, but all behavior makes sense. And we can now say
Oh,
that all behavior
yes.
makes sense given their worldview, right?
Right, right. And then when you look at the brain and behavioral science on top of that, like what you just said, it's all bought and paid for, that's sunk cost, right?
Yeah.
Behavioral science concept. And one of the things what's so the more we hang out with people who think like us, the more we begin to believe our worldview is the right worldview. And then the less understanding and the less compassionate we become towards other worldviews. So that's an interesting thing. We always say to people, we invite you into curiosity and not judgment.
Yeah.
And if you notice that you're judging someone, some situation, or if you're becoming defensive, that's a really good place to turn to curiosity, kind of understand what's my reaction here, because I know you know this. We can't control the other person much as we might want to, but we can influence them through our own actions and responses to what's going on in any given situation.
No, I think, I don't know if that's considered a practice, but, whenever a person feels that judgment coming up, the tendency is to wanna make a comment or refute it.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And the better response would be just start with a question.
Right. Yeah,
But
exactly.
but a curiosity-based question rather than an accusative question, like,
Right.
"You don't really believe that, do you, Kathy?" Isn't
Right.
kind of the question that's gonna really move things ahead.
Or what the heck is wrong with you?
Yeah, 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 exactly. Yes, just to I have a checklist of things, which ones apply to you. This I find this really interesting. So reality and helpful. Reality, history, future, values, practices, knowledge. So, how if a person feels that their worldview isn't serving them or through conversation with them, you feel that their worldview isn't serving them, how do you go about shifting that without it being manufactured. So it's not just a head shift. It's kind of like a full person, whole body shift.
So I such an interesting question because there are so many routes to self-awareness, self-understanding, and the 6 dimensions framework is really simply one of them, but that's where I would probably go back to values and practices and maybe knowledge, because what are the practices that we have around self-awareness? Meditation, journaling, uh, having like talking to somebody, identifying your feelings when they arise and not being self-judgmental about your own feelings, as they arise. And I think what's interesting is most people are more, um, they're thinking more about someone else needs to change their worldview, that they think that they need to change their worldview. And I know I skipped past knowledge, but, because I just wanted to mention, like, maybe with knowledge, we begin to look at what are the sources of information that I'm paying attention to, and does that serve me? Or, could I be looking at a broader source of knowledge and look at opinions I don't necessarily agree with to try to understand where they come from? Or could I just shut down the social media streams that I'm consumed by so that I can be in a better, more grounded place? Now, those would be some of the questions I would ask. But getting, back to a point you just made a minute ago, we um, developed a webinar called "Why Won't You Change Your Mind, Damn It?" And we talked about things like the more we argue, the more we reinforce neural pathways in our brain around the point we're arguing. So you say something, I don't agree with it. I start arguing. We argue these different points of view. One of us doesn't usually get closer to the other. We actually usually get further apart. And so, to your point, how do you get someone to change their mind? Ask a good question. Listen more, talk less, and when we're asking questions, the questions are not so much about why do you think that way? It's more about, so what is it that's influenced your thinking so that you're
Yes.
thinking the way? Or who has influenced your thinking? Because it takes us out of thinking about what we're thinking about to thinking about how we got to that perspective. And usually we're not thinking about that.
So I just dove into physics in my mind for a moment. Why on earth I did that? And it's kind of the opposite way physics works because if with magnets,
Hmm.
likes repel,
Right. Oh,
right?
right. Yes. Yep.
Right? Whereas, the way that magnets usually work, positive, negative attract each other, but it doesn't seem to happen in life that way.
It doesn't, does it?
Right? It seems like it just increases the polarization. One of the challenges I think that, I have, Kathy, is around the knowledge one is, the truth value of anything is questionable.
Right.
And it's not just, what knowledge is available to you, but what do you choose to believe? And that's an automatic filter on
Right.
the knowledge,
Right.
and like you said, it's listening to non-traditional sources or list opinions other than your own, but even then there's filters going on because I've started by thinking it's different from my own. That one's a real tough one these days, especially with social media,
Yeah.
where everything.
Well, and our brain works against us, honestly, most of the time because we've got confirmation bias going on, which is 24/7. It's happening. We don't even know it's happening, but you go to your computer to look something up and you land on the very first point that agrees with what you're already thinking. And then we rarely look for the next opposing points of view.
I remember I may attribute this to I'm thinking Edward de Bono, but I may not. But
Hmm.
so talk about an active system and a passive system in the way that
Yes.
information
Yep.
comes in. And a passive system would be, imagine a box with sand in it, and you drop a steel ball into it, and it makes a depression there.
Mm.
You drop another steel ball into it, it could be right beside it, it just stays where it is. All over the place, they stay where they are. But in
Mm.
an active system, it's kind of like a
Mm.
semi-viscous liquid or something like
Huh.
that. or waterbed. Like
Right.
you, I realize some people might not know what waterbeds are, or rotary phones, or things like that, or
Right.
records, but you drop it in and it starts to create a little depression, and anything else that lands even close to that follows in, right? So eventually, if it falls close enough, it just reinforces where that is. And I think our
Right.
minds tend to work more like an active system, where things come in and it goes into these predetermined filters or
Right. Right.
mindsets that we have, or filters, and those are tough to shift. And I think your point about asking the right questions is really important. There's a fellow out here, I'm gonna gap on his name, but he wrote a book called, I'm Right and You're an Idiot.
Oh my
Comedy,
god, I love that book.
yeah, on the lack of good public discourse and kind of
Right.
things like
Yes,
that.
yes. Put together by someone in BC. I saw it on a
Yeah,
bookshelf
yeah.
one day, like, years ago, and I'm like, "I have to buy that book," and it's really good.
Yeah, no, he ran, I'm not sure if he still does, but a PR agency. A friend of mine actually used to work for him, but it just even just like you just mentioned that title and people kinda go, "Yeah, I see that." I remember one time talking to Bishop Michael Ingham out here, and he was an Anglican bishop who was supporting same-sex unions that
Mm,
didn't go over really well in parts of the
mm,
Anglican Church. And I remember having a chat with him about the challenges he had, that his family had, all these other kinds of things. And he said, I get way more support from clerics from other religions, other
mm,
denominations than many people
awesome.
within my own church. And he said, the battle we need to fight is not one religion versus another. It's against fundamentalism of any sort, because there's no conversation.
Right.
They're so
Right.
right about and stuck in their current aspect of reality, history, future, values, practices, knowledge.
Right.
There's no room for a conversation, and part of it, and you do this, Kathy, because you have these sessions, is to give people a space where they can come together and explore that in a curiosity based rather than judgmental
Mhm.
fashion,
Mhm. Right.
right? And I don't think we have enough of those spaces, either online or more importantly in person,
Mm.
to get to explore these things. I don't know what the solution is. I'm getting clear on what the problem is.
Well, and I just wanna talk a minute about the brain as well, because the brain, its primary function is to keep us safe. And so when you describe the balls falling in the sand, that makes complete sense. I think it's Sam something like that, who wrote a book on thinking fast and thinking slow.
Yes. Yeah.
And so the brain will think fast all the time. It's more important for it to be speedy and wrong than slow and right, because it goes back to when our brains were formed in the, Sahara deserts and jungles and all of that. We needed to be able to react quickly, to be able to be safe. And so the brain hasn't evolved a tremendous amount since then. And so the brain doesn't like change. The brain likes predictability. The brain likes stability. It's okay with novelty. And if we're inviting our own learning, that's one thing. If it's coming from outside of us, it's more threatening than not. And then I mentioned neural pathways a minute ago, but the one of the things that we've more recently in the last couple of years came across is the idea of neurochemicals. And so the brain is emitting neurochemicals 24/7 pretty much. And there are some neurochemicals that make us feel good, so we get a little jolt of feeling good, and there are some that make us feel bad. The interesting thing when we relate it back to our worldviews and whether we change our minds or not, when our worldview encounters information that is different than the worldview perspective we hold, the brain emits a bad feeling neurochemical, so we feel physically uncomfortable,
Mm, mm,
even if the information that we're confronted with is correct.
right. Okay.
And then it also works the other way. If we encounter information that's consistent with our worldviews, even if that information is incorrect, the brain goes, "Oh, this is good," and gives us a little jolt of feeling better.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's compounded, like it's not just a thing that's happening in our minds, it's also physically happening in our bodies.
It's like we are we are designed to be right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. And it's like I have grandchildren now. They're almost 8, 6, and 4. And the fascinating thing is kids apologizing and how hard that is for them. And it's so or to admit that they're wrong, like, so it's so inbred in us that they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing, but, like, to get to that point of being able to apologize to someone is a really interesting dilemma.
I'm thinking about some other pieces that are coming together here for me around this, our daughter, super bright, loves to learn, does not like to be taught.
I love that.
Drives her
Yes,
crazy, even if
exactly.
you just offer something up for examination
Right,
or explanation. I know. You don't have to
right.
tell me that, right? And it's, where's the entry point? I don't know. And she's 26, so maybe another 10 or 15 years, she'll be open to a question to explore that. I don't think she's into I could be totally wrong about this, but into self-reflection and
Mm,
learning about herself. I think times that comes when someone's had a crisis, something forces them to hold up the mirror,
right.
right?
Right,
But,
right, right.
yeah, but all that reinforcing, being right and reinforcing our mindset, it's, um it's a huge one to overcome. And, and you just hear so many things in the news today that kind of implies we're right and they're wrong. And, I
Right.
won't get into politics, but that's often the case.
Yep.
And it's not, let's find a place to come together and see what if together we can find something better. I mean, this is why my work this year, I want to focus on the notion of building bridge builders, people that are able
Right.
to build bridges, to look at that as a metaphor and bring things and people together. But it takes tremendous courage because when you're standing in the middle, you're the enemy of both sides. Right? That's the worldview. If you're not with me, you're against me.
Oh,
It's
so
one or the
interesting.
other. But so Kathy, if people are driving and we don't want them to be writing down all of these
Ah,
kinds of things,
yes.
but we want them to be able to think about something on their way to wherever they're going. What's a question that people could ponder about worldview that would say, I am so glad I listened to this podcast
Mm.
today.
Well, we'll, often ask people once we just talk about worldviews, even without the 6 dimensions framework,
Hmm,
where they have like, now that they think about prior situations, they can begin to identify where they might have seen the impact of worldviews.
hmm,
So whether that's their own worldview or some conversation that happened in a group or some choice that their organization made, they can begin to see that or the interplay of worldviews. It's like, oh, of course, at work, the finance department saw things differently than the marketing department,
hmm,
because s that's also really true, so people begin to see that, or in community situations, people will see that. And then related to that becomes the question of, so how is my worldview influencing how I'm showing up in a conversation or in a relationship, or how is it influencing how strongly I'm holding on to a belief or a perspective or an opinion. And another good question could be, when am I aware that my worldview shifted? And how did that happen? Because I think at the very beginning of this, you said you asked that question around what happens. Do I have control over my own worldview? And the answer is yes, you do. Once you have an awareness of where your worldview has come from and where your perspectives have come from, then you have the option to be intentional about it. So I could choose to still have all of the same perspectives, but now
hmm.
I bring a different awareness to it versus I am being impacted and influenced by my worldview without my awareness of it.
That's fabulous. So those of you that are listening, pay attention to what Kathy just said. And I just had a product idea. Unfortunately, my mind kind of goes all over the place. And so
I love that though.
I thought what would be really cool is to like it when you used to get tested for your eyes back in
Yes.
the old days before they had all the fancy stuff. You'd have kind of a lens frame, and the
Yep.
optometrist would drop different lenses, and it says better, worse, better, worse. Be really interesting to have a set of glasses that could hold different filters, 6 different filters, right? And each filter being something that influences the way that you
Right.
look at the world as a physical metaphor. And, If there's one that's kind of really requiring you to have cataract surgery, what is the one that's there? Because then we're at choice. Like if I realize I do have these different filters
Mhm.
or different these 6 different areas. Once I'm aware of that, I'm more at choice. I have agency over which ones
Right.
I choose to pay attention to and be able to look at which
Mhm.
ones I need to change. Because overall, my particular worldview is causing more problems than providing
Right.
solutions.
Well, I always go back to curiosity. Like, let's just be curious about what am I reacting to and why, and to let go of self-judgment about if I'm angry or I'm sad or depressed, not talking clinical depression. Um, but even if you are clinically depressed, like, that's to just let things land where they need to land and also flow through. So curiosity, I think, is the biggest practice that people can bring pretty much to anything that we do. And then the other thing that I'll say is that once people have an awareness of worldviews, you don't even really need to, it's not like you have to go through each of the dimensions to begin that self-reflection practice or to bring an awareness to a situation. Because people will now go, oh, that's their worldview perspective. Or what is my worldview about this group of people that I'm judging for things I don't even know, what their actual practices are or what they actually do, but just because stereotypes and biases, as we mentioned before, they all come into our worldview perspectives.
So someone's going to jump on this. I probably shouldn't say it on this podcast, but I think great topic for a book is "Curiosity Killed the Crap." And crap is probably an acronym for something like crazy
I like
responses to actual people
oh,
or something like that, but
I like the way
I
your
think it
mind
really
works.
does, like, what's the
Right.
crap that we're carrying around that's not serving a purpose?
I love that.
So there you go. So, Kathy, thank you so much. This has been really interesting and personally, I found it very valuable as a way to think about things, so
Great.
thank you so much for being my guest today.
Well, thanks for allowing me to come on your podcast 'cause, I thoroughly enjoy the conversation and I appreciating hanging out with you a bit.
Wow. Fortunately, that's totally mutual. So, this has been David Gouthro. Discover fresh perspectives. The only thing I can guarantee is that next week there'll be a new person with more fresh perspectives. Thanks very much for listening. Subscribe now because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.